Welcome to Nature's Guardians. I'm Micah Siegel. Each week, I talk with people working to save and help animals around the world. They are nature's guardians, and you can become one too. Today, I'm talking with Lucy Howell and Rose Foster, both research scientists at University of Canterbury. Welcome to the show, Rose and Lucy.
Hey, yeah, nice to be here.
Okay, so I'm ready to learn about some penguins. So, Lucy, do you have a presentation?
Yes, I do. Let me just pull that up.
Okay, cool.
So I am a PhD student at the University of Canterbury in Aotearoa, New Zealand, specifically on the South Island, on the south east coast. We're lucky enough here in Aotearoa, that we have a number of penguins that visit our waters, and specifically we have three here that breed on mainland New Zealand. So we have the hoiho or yellow-eyed penguin, the tawaki or fielded crested penguin, and the korora or little blue penguin. And these are the guys I'm going to be talking to you about today. So the korora are the smallest of the 18 penguin species. They come in at about 1 kilogram and are about 25 centimeters tall, which I think is about 9.8 inches. And they're pretty cute little guys. They are found across the coast of New Zealand, and also the southern coast of Australia. Specifically, I work on the korora at one colony here in New Zealand, and that colony is found near Ototahi, Christchurch, on the Horamaka or Banks Peninsula, in a place called Pohatu. So Pohatu is one of the bays on the outer edge of the peninsula. It's currently a working sheep farm owned by the Helps family. And we're lucky enough to have a marine reserve, one of the oldest marine reserves in the South Island of New Zealand. It came into place in 1999, I believe. And the Helps family have been really involved in the conservation of the korora here in New Zealand. And it started implementing a program where they put in nest boxes, and those are the nest boxes that I'm lucky enough to work with today. So consider myself pretty lucky because this is a site that I get to work at regularly. We have these beautiful blue bays. That rectangle there is the area that we have our penguin nest boxes. And our little blues are slightly different here in Canterbury. So we have what is called the white flippered morphotype. So if you see those two pictures of penguins on the side, on the left side, we have our white flippered, which is a much lighter blue color. And they also have two bands of white, one on either side of their flipper, as opposed to just one you can see on one side. Sometimes that band can be pretty extreme and can extend across the flipper. So you get these large patches of white. This morphological difference is thought to be primarily or potentially due to the water we have in this region. So you can see in this picture that we get this very sort of bright blue water. It's mainly due to glacial silt. This is an old volcanic area, and a lot of the South Island is a lot of a historically glacial region. So that's pretty exciting. The guys here, look, there's the same species, but there's some variation in behavior as well. So the Australian penguins and the penguins down at Otago will often double clutch a year, whereas our penguins here, we tend to just get one clutch. And so the Helps family have also been involved in starting the Helps Pohatu Conservation Trust. And through that trust, they monitor the penguins every week. So they check all of the nest boxes, which is about 230, I believe. There's more penguins there, but a number of them in natural burrows. So we only check the ones in nest boxes. We've started microchipping a number of the penguins so we can get an idea of who's who. They also run some rehab from there, and Dr. Rachel Hickox, who's the lead scientist at Pohatu, is involved in managing a number of projects. Her area of expertise is tracking, so we're starting to see where some of these penguins are going to feed during breeding season. This is important because our seabirds tend to be some of the species most affected by changes in the environment, but we tend not to see those effects until after they've caused dire effects. So over the 2022-2023 breeding season, we experienced marine heat waves around New Zealand. And we noticed that a lot of our adult penguins were abandoning their chicks. During breeding season, they're what we call central place foragers, which is where they're limited to foraging within a certain distance from where they're breeding. They can't go too far because that would mean leaving their chicks. And if there's any sort of challenges there around what they can eat, they're really restricted, and therefore you end up with this toss-up between sort of look after themselves and get enough food for themselves versus raising those chicks. Luckily, last season we had a much better year in terms of the marine temperature and chick survival. So we do get these fluctuations depending on the conditions each year, which is where my specific work comes in. So I work with, a lot less glamorously, their poo. We can see here there's a lot of it. And there's a couple of things I'm looking at in the poo. One of the reasons I'm using this is it's a fairly non-invasive sample. I just collect it from the ground. I don't need the penguin to be there, which means we sort of limit that stress we're putting on these birds. And we can also sort of maximize the information we're getting during this monitoring process. So the process of collecting is fairly simple. I just sort of wait for them to poo, scoop it up. And one of the main things I'm using this for is diet. So we know from studies across their range that they eat sort of small fishes, cephalopods, so things like squid, and crustaceans. How much of these they eat varies a lot. Some regions they're very fish heavy, other regions they're very cephalopod heavy. But a lot of this data comes from Australia, so we're not sure how much it applies here in New Zealand. And so and also how much it varies, particularly in those years where we're seeing massive abandonment of chicks. And so I've got samples that I collect for the past couple of years, and I'm continuing to collect. And so we can start to see some of those patterns. The way it sort of works is each of these species have their own DNA. That DNA may be broken up a bit as it's digested and pooed out, but I can collect that sample and dissolve it and sort of filter it so I get just the DNA. And I can use a process we call meta barcoding. So much like when the computer programs they have at supermarkets where you scan a barcode and it matches it up to an item, we can get this section of genetic code and match it up to lists of known species genetics, and it will find the best match. And so we can see what species there are in that poo. Something else I'm looking at is also stress hormones. So when a penguin experiences stress, they release what corticosterone, and this sort of prepares the body for that fight or flight. And as it's broken down, some of the things it's broken down into come out in the feces. So we can look at levels of those to get an idea of the stress they're experiencing, and start to build patterns and see where there are links with things like diet, and just get a better idea of how the health of these birds are going. And specifically, because around breeding season, they've got to be coming back to their nests for their chicks. We have a lot of data from this period, but I'm hoping to get more of an idea of what's happening outside of that period. Although I do feel pretty lucky to get to hang out with these birds while they have cute fluffies in the nest. But yeah, that's my presentation. And I will stop sharing now.
So why do the parents abandon their chicks?
So it comes down to a decision between, do they continue to feed their chicks and potentially not make it themselves, or have their chicks make it? Or do they leave their chicks survive themselves and breed again and have chicks at another time? And so we do actually want them to be making that decision to prioritize themselves. Chicks are pretty vulnerable, and juveniles are pretty vulnerable in that first year. So our adults have more of a chance of surviving. And so we want them to be continuing over the chicks, technically, to a degree. Obviously, having both survive is the ideal. But in periods where you get odd years where it's particularly bad, it is a good thing that the adults are prioritizing themselves. Um, but yeah, it's not a great strategy to continue pursuing it when it's going to put both your chicks and yourself in danger, basically.
What can you tell us about the other two species?
I can tell you a bit, and then not. I'm work pretty much just with the little blues myself. But the other two species, they're not doing as well as the little blues overall. The hoiho or yellow-eyed in particular, are struggling here in New Zealand. Um, they have a lot more crossover and competition with things like fisheries. They're also pretty shy, so if there's any disruption to their nesting, they tend to abandon. Um, the the little blues are slightly different in that they live in burrows, so live underground. There is a degree of protection there, although predators like stoats can still get into those spaces. Whereas uh, hoiho and tawaki are a bit more vulnerable in those spaces. Um, we also have a big problem in New Zealand with things like dogs attacking birds on beaches. Uh, that's a huge one. Um, it's pretty important to particularly listen to signs about keeping dogs on leads in these spaces, or avoiding them during vulnerable seasons. They're less widespread, so you can get the little blues right across New Zealand, including up in North Island, whereas hoiho and tawaki are mainly found down here, particularly tawaki are called the Fiordland crested because that's the area we tend to find them in, the Fiordlands, which is sort of at the bottom of New Zealand, on the west side of it.
So, where you are, is it remote or are you sort of like in a city?
Where I am right now is in the city. The site I work at is a couple of hours out the city, maybe a bit less than that. Um, so the track to get to it is a four-wheel drive, so it's a bit trickier to get to. So although it's not far from the city, it's fairly remote in that sense, and pretty at risk of being sort of cut off and has been cut off in extreme weather events. But it's not the case with all the colonies. We're one of the largest colonies here in New Zealand. Another one of the largest colonies here is in a place called Oamaru. They're right in town, basically. So they have a lot more issues than we do in terms of having to educate people about the risks of traffic. Little blues have no awareness of cars, really. They'll quite happily go and stand underneath a car. That's not a problem we have as much just because we don't have a lot of cars coming through.
So, we want to learn two things. So, one, we want to learn about their biology and the interesting facts about them. Like why is their feathers blue? Why are they so small and why do the other ones have yellow eyebrows? And then some numbers, like how many are hit by cars or chased down by dogs, and the
Mhm.
real problems and the solutions you're trying to implement.
Yep. So in terms of the feathers being so blue, I mentioned in the presentation that we see that variation with our penguins here. So a lot of that is to do with the water they're in. So if you think they have a mix of predators in the marine environment, but one of the ones we see the most here is giant petrels. So they're attacking the penguins from above. Um, so if you're a sort of bright blue color and you're in bright blue water, you're much less likely to be seen. Um,
Yeah.
Similarly, if we have predators sort of looking up from underneath while they're sort of floating on top of the water, they've got that white belly, and they're against the bright light above. So that sort of helps protect them. It's a way of them being less visible, even though we don't think of that with penguins as much because when we see them on land, they're very obvious.
Mm.
Um, in terms of size, I'm not really sure I can answer the question why they're so small. We did used to have some very like there's evidence of some very large penguins that have since gone extinct. Um, So there seems to be the trend towards smaller penguins in general, but like the difference between little blues and emperors, for example, is pretty major in size. In terms of, I don't have exact numbers on, so this is one of the problems we have in New Zealand, and didn't mention at the start, but I am Australian, not a Kiwi. But I'm working on the penguins here in New Zealand and not Australia because little blues are actually one of our most studied penguins. But most of that research is coming out of Australia, particularly certain sites in Australia. And because they're what we call a generalist, and so in terms of diet and things, they vary quite a lot. They're quite adaptable in that sense. There is a huge amount of variation between penguins at different colonies and different sites. So we can't say for sure that we can take that information from New Zealand and apply it here, from Australia, sorry, and apply it here in New Zealand. And so we're working on trying to build up a better picture of our local penguins here, and get a better idea of how they're doing here specifically. We know that they have, well, for example, we see every year penguins killed by things like feral cats or mustelids, so stoats and ferrets in particular. Eggs will be taken by hedgehogs. All of these are introduced predators here in New Zealand. New Zealand has only one native land mammal, the microbat. And so all our predatory mammals we have here on land are introduced from mainly Europe, but also Australia. And so they can cause sort of huge issues here. So we did see a massive reduction in the penguin colony in the early 2000s, and a lot of that was to do with a boom in the ferret population. So there's pretty extensive predator trapping goes on here. So they are constantly trapping these predators, but of course some slip through the net.
So the blue penguins are doing pretty well, right?
Yeah, they're considered of least concern. That varies a lot depending on, well, the least concern doesn't, but depending on where you look at it, we have some colonies that are doing better and some that are declining. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of variation there.
What should we learn about emperor penguins?
Hi, Micah. I can show you a quick presentation that I've made all about emperor penguins, if you like.
Okay, perfect.
So similar to Lucy, I study emperor penguins. I study penguins at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. And sorry. And I think I'm a bit biased, but I think emperor penguins are one of the coolest species on the planet. Like first of all, they're absolutely beautiful. The little like ombre yellow coloring going down their neck. But they're also incredibly fascinating. So they're really beautifully well adapted to survive and thrive in such an incredibly harsh and difficult environment that is Antarctica. So a bit of background, there are 66 currently discovered colonies of emperor penguins around the Antarctic coastline. Almost half of those have never been visited in person. They've only been discovered using satellite imagery. The current largest known colony is in the Ross Sea, where my research takes place, at Coleman Island. And emperor penguins, one of the main things that differentiates them from every other species that calls Antarctica home is that they actually choose to breed throughout the Antarctic winter. So they do this because they breed on fast ice, which is only there through winter, and then it breaks up every summer. So to make sure that they are able to complete their breeding cycle and have their chicks reach fledge, which means that they're ready to leave the colony, they need to start when the fast ice forms so that they have long enough for their chicks to, or for their eggs to hatch and then the chicks to grow up big enough. But because they breed through the winter, they are incredibly difficult to study. So they all arrive back at their colonies in late March or early April, which aligns perfectly with when the sun disappears from Antarctica. And because they breed in Antarctica, we rely heavily on satellite imagery to study them, and satellite imagery doesn't work when there's no sunlight. So we use the springtime abundances to try and estimate the population size, but it's a very difficult calculation to estimate how many were there earlier in the season based on how many are still there in springtime. So one of the major threats facing emperor penguins is their reliance on fast ice. And it has been shown at many colonies around the Antarctic coastline that if the ice breaks out before the chicks are ready to fledge, that can have serious consequences on their population numbers. So this is a publication taken from 2019, which spoke about the population collapse at Harley Bay, which at the time was one of the largest colonies in Antarctica, a similar size to Coleman Island. And over a 3-year period, the fast ice broke out before the chicks were ready to fledge, which led from a population that was 25,000 breeding birds down to 0 or a couple of hundred. That doesn't mean the birds died, but it means that they had to abandon that colony completely and move to other parts of the Antarctic coast. So this here is an example of the satellite imagery taken from that period. You can see the colony there up at Windy Creek. And then the following year in November, so chicks fledge generally during mid to late December or early January, depending on their location. And if the ice breaks out before December, then the chicks don't survive, basically. So this was in 2015 when there was still ice. But in 2016, the ice broke out early, the same in 2017. And then in 2018, there was ice, but because of the previous years, there was a far smaller breeding colony found at that location. So my research is based in the Ross Sea, and I used satellite imagery to understand the ice breakout patterns in the Ross Sea at our 7 colonies. This was Coleman Island. In 2016, there was approximately 24,000 breeding birds there estimated, and the ice began to break out by late November. So the colony generally breeds just here along this point, kind of basically right where the ice began to break out. And we at this stage don't have enough data to observe a signal in that breeding failure for that year. But I'm really interested to get more satellite imagery from 2020 and 2021 to see if there is a difference in how many birds breed at that location following that breakout. So getting into my research, I study the emperor penguins in the Ross Sea, where there are 7 colonies. They range in size from about 1,000 birds at Cape Crozier and Beaufort Island, all the way up to the largest colony, which is found at Coleman Island. There's also 1 colony in the eastern Ross Sea, which is at Cape Colbeck, which is the 2nd largest colony of about 18,000 breeding birds. So I study my birds using satellite imagery. As I said earlier, satellite imagery has really changed the game and how we can study this species because they are so incredibly isolated. They breed through winter. The vast majority of them are not found near research stations or anything like that. So the invention of satellite imagery analysis has really changed the game on how we can understand how the populations are doing. So this is VHR satellite imagery, or very high resolution. In this image here, you can see this is at Cape Colbeck in the eastern Ross Sea. And at this stage, the birds are just that very small smudge on the ice. But when we zoom in, you can actually see quite a lot of detail there. And because it's VHR, it gets between 30 to 60 centimeters resolution. So you can actually see individual birds standing on the ice when they are hanging out by themselves. But it gets a bit more difficult to tell who's who when they are actually in those larger huddles, which they do spend a lot of time in. So we estimate the population size by calculating the area that the colony covers each year. So this is a processed image where I have basically taught the computer to tell the difference between a pixel that is ice versus penguin versus guano. And then we extract all the parts of the penguin, all the parts of the image that are penguin, and then we have the area of penguin that year. So this is what we call a supervised classification process. So we create training points where we teach the computer what a pixel of penguin looks like. We then run it through the program, and it classes the whole image as either penguin, ice, or guano. We then extract just the penguin parts of that, and then we can calculate the area. So my supervisor, Michelle, we collaborated with a whole group of wonderful penguin experts from around the world, and we produced the first decadal time series of emperor penguin populations across their entire range. So we looked at 50 different colonies over a 10-year period between 2009 and 2018. And we found there was likely a decrease in the global population by about 10%. But there is a lot of uncertainty in this data because we are limited in when we can look at the penguins. So we only have data from springtime, and it would be perfect if we could get information on who arrives at the colony at the very start of the season, because that includes the ones that won't be successful breeders, the ones that won't match up with a partner, and both sexes, whereas we're less certain about who remains at the colony when we have imagery available. But that is currently being worked on to solve that problem. So using that method, I estimated the population size for all 7 colonies in the Ross Sea over 15 years. So we looked at between 2005 and 2018. And we found that the populations fluctuate considerably each year. So there could be an extra few thousand birds breeding at a colony on a given year, and then the next year it could drop down again. But over the 14-year period, we found 3 significant trends. So we observed a significantly decreasing trend at Beaufort Island, which coincided with an increasing trend at Cape Crozier, which is the closest colony to Beaufort Island. And we also observed an increasing trend at Cape Colbeck, which is the only colony in the eastern Ross Sea. So we were really interested in understanding kind of the drivers behind these fluctuations, and whether they are in response to the environment or just fewer birds choosing to breed on a given year. But we also observed some really interesting patterns in terms of asynchrony or synchrony between how a population goes up and goes down at the same time, or how 2 colonies go up and down at the same time. So this was particularly noticeable at between Coleman Island and Cape Colbeck, which were the 2 largest colonies. Between 2005 and 2011, the colonies decreased, Coleman Island decreased by about 6,000 birds, while Cape Colbeck increased by about 6,000 birds. And we have no ability at this stage to say if they were the same birds, but it's just a really fascinating observation that we made through having continuous time series data of an entire region. And we're really curious because these 2 colonies are about 1,000 kilometers apart, and emperor penguins are generally thought to often stick to the same colony that they breed at. So whether this is just a coincidence or something more, I'm hoping to be able to put some tags on some birds at both of these colonies at some stage, and figure out whether they do often go back to the same colony, or if there's more flexibility than we once thought, because that has huge implications for how the species could respond to changes in their environment. We also found interest between Cape Crozier and Beaufort Island, which these 2 colonies are about 80 kilometers apart. The decrease at Beaufort Island aligned very well with the increase at Cape Crozier. And and sorry, my toddler's trying to get in the room. And the environment at Beaufort Island is incredibly unstable. So we recorded 12 early ice breakouts over 15 years at Beaufort Island, which is I'm amazed that birds still choose to breed there. Honestly, it's a very compared to other locations in the Ross Sea, it's a very difficult environment. So we think that birds are moving from Beaufort Island further south to Cape Crozier. We also observe patterns of synchrony between groups of colonies. So these are, this here is, the middle plot is between Coleman Island and Cape Washington. And then the bottom plot is between Franklin Island, Cape Roget, and Cape Colbeck. And these colonies are not close to each other, but you can see they all go up and they all go down at the same time, which is a really fascinating observation. And that brings up so many more questions that we want to ask. So in summary, emperor penguins are hugely threatened by the risk of, by the environment changing, which could alter both the sea ice environment, which has an effect on their prey availability, and then the fast ice environment for breeding success. So they are forecast to become quasi-extinct by 2100, but they breed, but because they breed through the Antarctic winter, it's incredibly difficult to get an accurate picture of how the populations are doing. But I want to emphasize the fact that emperor penguins have persisted through a huge variety of different Antarctic climates, and they adapt their environment pretty well. So while they are hugely threatened, there is still a huge amount of hope for the species, and I don't want them to be put in the too hard basket, whereas it's a very difficult problem, but I have a lot of faith. I have a lot of faith that we will figure it out. And that's me.
What do you know about the food, what they eat?
So emperor penguins in the Ross Sea in particular eat a lot of Antarctic silverfish. So in Antarctica, kind of the keystone species of the marine environment is usually Antarctic krill. But because the Ross Sea is over much of the continental shelf, it's much more shallower than other parts of Antarctica, which means it has a different food web structure. And most of the species that are found in the Ross Sea rely on Antarctic silverfish. But they also eat cephalopods, different juvenile species of bigger fish, and they eat crustaceans as well.
So what's it like being out in Antarctica with those penguins? And do you have any penguin stories?
Well, I am a bit of an imposter in terms of penguin scientists because I have not done field work on emperor penguins, but I did go down to do field work with Weddell seals in 2020, and some emperor penguins did show up to where we were doing our field work, and I squealed so loud, and people were like, "They're just penguins." I'm like, "No, they're not. They're so cool." I think Weddell seals are also amazing, but emperor penguins, they definitely have a very soft spot in my heart. They're just so cool. So yeah, I was pretty excited to see them. There wasn't a very large colony. I think there was maybe like 10 or 15. They just showed up and were waddling around. I can tell you about the coloration on their neck and on their beaks. So they're called auricular patches, I believe. And research has found that the brightness and the coloration of their feathers along their necks, as well as they have small patches of like orangey pink along their beaks. And those features are tied to mate selection and the health of the individual. So you want to choose a mate that has particularly bright feathers and a particularly, so the beak plate, it's called, is UV reflectant. And so you want to choose a mate with a particularly impressive feathers and beak plates so that you believe that they will stick around to look after your chick while you're out foraging.
Okay. Lucy, do you have any stories?
Of the little blues.
Yeah.
Um, I guess my favorite one is one that I was not actually there for. But Pohatu have been putting nest boxes in for a long time. And like I said, little blues are pretty adaptable. We're quite regularly having to confiscate things from nest boxes. I recently confiscated a butter knife that had found its way into one, and quite a few of our pens ended up in a nest box. But they run kayak tours out at Pohatu, and many years ago, it used to just be cash, and they'd keep a bum bag or fanny pack with the money in it in one of the sheds. And one day it went missing, and they thought, no, that sucks. Someone's come and stolen it, but we better keep it somewhere safer. And then a little while later, they came across a penguin nest and found that it had been lined with money. So a very resourceful penguin had come across it and been like, this looks like a good nesting material, and decided to use that.
That's really funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do people in New Zealand think about penguins?
Oh, I think it probably depends who you ask. I think most Kiwis are pretty proud of penguins. We're one of the countries that gets the most. I mentioned the 3 that breed here on mainland New Zealand, but I do believe they've had 13 of the 18 species in their waters, although that is including the Ross dependency where Rose works, because New Zealand looks after a lot of that area. And so, yeah, I think there's a pretty strong tie there. Penguins are, I mean, the little blues are a native species here, so they're considered what is called a tonga species in Te Reo Māori, and that means treasured. So, and lots of people here have stories about, they're very noisy. Over the breeding season, it takes us 2 days to do the monitoring, and we will stay out at Pohatu. And you quite regularly be woken up in the middle of the night by penguins shouting. Because there's a lot of them. And so lots of people have stories about when they were younger, having penguins coming in and out of areas. That's a thing you get less. They've been much more restricted to areas where there are less people now, just because of things like cars and disturbances like that, and cats and dogs and things. But I think generally people hold them pretty dear. A lot of people are really really excited to go out and look for them. Little blues, despite being one of the most common penguin species we get here, you don't actually see a lot. They come in after it's got dark, and leave before it gets light. So they're considered, although they're diurnal whilst at sea, they're nocturnal while on land. So even when they're fairly regularly on land during breeding season, your chances of seeing them without sort of joining a tour or that sort of thing are pretty low. And I know that there are a few organizations, so Oamaru there's a penguin colony down there, and they have live cameras in some of their nest boxes. And at Pohatu, we're a huge bay, so you get penguins sort of feeding in all around the bay, but they're funneled in a little bit more there, so you will get hundreds come on land at once, which is pretty incredible to get to see. So they do. You can watch that. Phillip Island in Australia has a similar situation. And lots of people will go to visit those. They're very cute for one, but also I feel like they've got a lot of character. Particularly when you work with them, you get some that are a lot more sort of feisty than others. I've certainly got a few scars from some of those.
Oh,
Yeah, they do bite. But yeah, I think generally most people would say they're pretty fond of the penguins.
okay. Besides the scars, pretty good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking with me today, Lucy and Rose. And thank you for watching. You can help animals by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. I'll see you next time on Nature's Guardians. Bye.